Now on 4, 30 years after James Hanratty was executed for the A6 murder, the first in a new season of True Stories reveals disturbing new evidence about the case.
Mum, what have I done to deserve this? No one can imagine what it is like to experience something like this. I wake up every morning and it seems like a dream, and I pray that one morning I will awake and it will not be a dream any longer.
Years ago this week, James Hanratty was hanged for the A6 murder. His innocence has been proclaimed ever since. Now there is disturbing new evidence that he was wrongly executed.
Mum, somebody somewhere knows the truth and will come forward. No matter what happens, we know that the country has made a terrible mistake.
My name is Valerie Jean Story. I am a civil servant. I work at the Road Research Laboratory, and I am a scientific assistant. I knew Michael John Gregston. He worked at the Road Research Laboratory. It was there I got to know him. On the 22nd of August, I saw Michael Gregston in the evening. When we got to the cornfield, we just pulled in about 5 or 6 feet from the road. It was late evening, not quite twilight. I had been to that same place before. We were there just over half an hour before anything happened. We were both very scared and asked the man what he wanted. We asked him not to shoot. We left the cornfield with Mike driving and the man in the back seat behind Mike. The gun was pointing at Mike. He said, "Keep facing the front and don't look round." At intervals he would say, "Turn right here, turn left here." After we had been on the A6 for a while, he said, "We'll have to stop, so I can have a kip. He said, turn off here. There appeared to be a dead end. The man said, turn the car around and stop. He said, turn the lights out. The man said to Mike, pass that bag over. Mike picked the bag up. He said, get out of the car. He pointed the gun at me and said, get in. If you don't get in, I'll shoot. He then raped me. There was a sudden bang. I felt something hit me, and I fell over. I felt my legs go numb. He didn't hit me this time. I could feel them go over my head. I lay perfectly still, pretending I was dead. I heard him walk away. I heard the car door slam.
Michael Gregston and Valerie Story set off from Slough last night to organise the Bedfordshire checkpoints in a motor rally for the staff of the Road Research Laboratory where they work. They picked up a hitchhiker. In the small hours of this morning, they were pushed out onto the patch of grass behind me, now screened, between this lay-by and the A6 road 8 miles south of Bedford. At 6:45, they were found by a workman. Mr. Gregston shot in the head and Miss Story in the chest. Was Miss Story able to say anything?
Yes, she was pretty coherent, considering the fact she'd obviously been badly wounded.
What did she say?
Well, she was able to give a description of the man. She was able to tell me who she was. She was able to say that a gunman had held them up at Slough. Rather, she'd picked him up at Slough, and that he'd held them up and shot her.
The shooting at Deadman's Hill was the most notorious crime of its day. It led to Britain's biggest investigation and longest murder trial. Yet even now, new evidence is still emerging, and while more remains hidden, the case will continue to reverberate. The crucial witness was Valerie's Story, who had miraculously survived.
I think Valerie's Story is about the only person that would have lived. I think most other women would have died. She was just really so determined to live. And wanted this man caught so much that she just pulled through, but she had an awful lot of courage. She was talking and was very angry at what had happened, and she kept repeating, you know, and asking me to promise her that we would catch the men concerned.
The police officer in whose division this happened is Superintendent Morgan of Biggleswade. Superintendent, what help do the police want from the public?
Well, we are anxious to trace a man of the following description: aged about 30 years, 5 feet 6, proportionate build, dark brown hair, palish face, brown eyes, very deep set, not very deep set, straight nose, wearing a dark lounge suit, and believed to have an East End London accent.
The murder hunt began. At 6:30 p.m., the getaway car was discovered in Ilford. The gunman, whose erratic driving had been noticed by eyewitnesses, had abandoned it at 7:15 in the morning. The Morris minor was taken to Scotland Yard for detailed forensic examination. The killer must have been in the car for almost 10 hours, and there was blood around the driver's seat. Police circulated a report that the murderer's clothing would be blood-stained. The next day, the A6 murder weapon was found on a London bus. A .38 Enfield revolver had been hidden with 60 rounds of ammunition on the top deck, under the back seat. Police were working off 2 photo fits, Valerie's Stories, and, on the right, one compiled by the witnesses who saw the getaway car in the early morning. Scotland Yard had been called in. The man detailed to head the investigation was one of the Metropolitan Police's most experienced detectives, Superintendent Bob Aycott. But amid growing public concern, the police had no real leads, no motive. Superintendent Aycott returned to Valerie's Story, still in hospital. "We've had 3 weeks so far," Aycott told her. "We have no name or anything. We depend entirely on you." But Aycott was disappointed. Story admitted that she and Michael Gregston, a married man with 2 children, were having an affair. But she insisted that this could not provide a motive for the murder. Janet Gregston, Michael Gregston's widow, who knew of her husband's affair, visited Valerie's Story in hospital. Afterwards, Mrs. Gregston said the killer must have been a maniac. On September the 11th, the murder hunt turned to London's Maida Vale. The police were telephoned by the manager of a cheap guest house. The Vienna Hotel would become a key location in the case. That morning, the manager was inspecting his bedrooms. He entered a basement room which hadn't been slept in for 3 weeks, not since the day before the murder. The room was supposedly cleaned regularly. But no one before the manager had spotted what was on a bedside chair. 2 spent cartridge cases. They came from the murder weapon. The police now had their first suspect, Peter Louis Alphon. Alphon, an unemployed drifter, was already under police scrutiny. In several respects, he matched Valerie Story's description of the killer. And Peter Alphon had checked into the Vienna hotel on the day of the murder under a false name. The police named Alphon as the wanted man. He gave himself up and, amid great publicity, was put on an identity parade. But Valerie's Story failed to pick him out. Alphon was released and celebrated with his mother. The police, who had been certain they had their man, had to start again. They returned to the Vienna hotel. Alphon had stayed in room 6. Now the police concentrated on room 24, the basement bedroom where the cartridge cases were found, and on the identity of another man who'd registered under a false name, J. Ryan. J. Ryan was James Hanratty, and he was the last occupant of room 24, where the cartridge cases from the murder weapon were found. James Hanratty was born and brought up in a North London Irish Catholic family. He was sometimes known as Ginger. He left school at 15 without any qualifications.
I mean, I'm not belittling him, but he was backward at school. I mean, he could just about read, he couldn't write. I mean, then it was the sporting page at the back. 16, 17, we used to dress up. In them days, you'd suit up, meet some girls and take them to the fun fair and that and different things. You know, we had some good times, you know?
But as a teenager, Hanratty headed for central London and Soho. Here, he made the acquaintance of a small-time criminal, Charles France.
He got in touch with France up in London, and from there he got into some very bad habits of housebreaking, and, you know, he was on the fiddle all the time with France. But in the course of different periods, he'd come home and then go away again. But any time he'd done anything wrong, he never done it at home. He always went to London to do it.
From 1955, Hanratty spent most of the next 6 years in and out of prison as he collected a series of convictions for housebreaking and car theft. On his release in March 1961, he returned to Soho. He renewed his friendship with Charles France and resumed thieving. In late September, Hanratty's family learned the police were looking for him, but they didn't know why.
A journalist from the Express said, come, and he asked about Acott, who'd been. Father said, he said, do you know, it's serious, they want your son in connection with the A6 murder. Well, it was like hitting you with a bombshell. I went up to the rehearsal club, which I knew he used, to look for him, because I knew Jimmy wouldn't take this seriously.
But Hanratty feared arrest of his latest housebreakings, and he went on the run. First, he telephoned Scotland Yard. He told Superintendent Acott where his clothes could be collected for forensic examination and stressed his innocence of the A6 murder. Then, he stole a Mark 7 Jaguar and drove north. Hanratty sometimes changed the colour of his ginger hair. He dyed it twice more during his fortnight on the run, ending up a startling orange. As a disguise, it was hopeless. The police knew Hanratty dyed his hair. On October the 11th, 7 weeks after the A6 murder, Hanratty was arrested at the Stavonia Cafe in Blackpool. By the following morning, Superintendent Acott was in Blackpool to interrogate him. Hanratty was driven south to face Valerie's story on a critical identity parade.
We stood in a line and Hanratty was brought in, and he was told in our hearing that he could stand where he wanted to in the line, and he had this extraordinary tension, the most tense human being I've ever seen in my life. It was absolutely electrifying. He had this very vivid coloured hair, which was very orangey, which was obviously dyed.
There had been reports that police were hunting a man with dyed hair. On parade, only Hanratty had dyed hair.
Valerie's story was brought in on like a trolley bed with a slightly sloping back, and then she was wheeled up and down and looked at everybody over and over again.
The killer had a London accent. Miss Story asked everyone to speak. Campaigners have always claimed that only Hanratty had a London accent.
And although impressions can be false, my feeling was that she took 15 or 20 minutes before she identified him. And that's about as much as I can remember. And she, too, was a very tense human being, which is pretty understandable.
Superintendent Aycott congratulated Valerie's Story. With this identification from the key witness, Aycott was satisfied that he finally had his man.
Jimmy just said, "Don't worry, Dad, this has got nothing to do with me. They'll find out in the end. Not to worry." Of course, you can't help worrying.
James Hanratty was charged with the rape and attempted murder of Valerie Story and with the murder of Michael Gregston.
Please, Mum, don't let anything upset you, because there is everything to look forward to. But you know I couldn't do a terrible thing like that. Though I am a bit of a crook, I wouldn't hurt a mouse.
The Bedfordshire magistrates, fearing local prejudice, committed Hanratty for trial in London at the Old Bailey. But the Crown had its way. The case was returned to Bedford. Hanratty pleaded not guilty on all 3 counts. Press and public scrambled for seats when the trial opened on January the 22nd, 1962. It was the most celebrated murder trial of its time. The judge at Bedford Special Assize was Mr. Justice Gorman. Counsel for the Crown were Graham Swanwick QC and his junior, Geoffrey Lane, who would become Lord Chief Justice. Their case against Hanratty was based on evidence of identification, evidence that would supposedly point to him as the killer in the Morris Minor. Before being abandoned in East London, the murder car had been seen by several witnesses. John Skillett had a near collision with the Morris Minor. He identified Hanratty as the driver. But his passenger, Edward Blackhall, better positioned, insisted it was not Hanratty. James Trower, a pedestrian, also identified Hanratty, despite having only a glimpse of the passing car and its driver. But the most dramatic testimony came from Valerie Story, who was brought to court on a stretcher. She recalled the attacker saying, "Call me Jim," and she identified Hanratty to the jury. Hanratty's barrister, Michael Sherard, cross-examined her and found her testimony unshakable.
Valerie Story, the crucial witness, although she had only a fleeting glimpse of the face of the assailant in the headlights of an oncoming car, was nevertheless prepared to pledge her oath that she had identified Hanratty correctly.
Of course Hanratty's the man. I was there, I saw him. There's no possible doubt whatsoever. Hanratty was guilty, beyond any doubt whatsoever.
Story had no doubt whatsoever, while acknowledging that on the crucial parade Hanratty had stood out like a carrot in a bunch of bananas. But at another parade, she had picked out a wholly innocent RAF corporal and identified him as the A6 killer.
Hanratty wasn't on that parade. I couldn't identify him. I just tried to pick out somebody, I suppose, who I thought looked like him. I made a mistake. The man had nothing to do with the case. It's just one of those things.
This year, numerous police papers relating to the case have been disclosed for the first time. Among them, the long hospital interview with Valerie Story. It reveals that a full month before identifying Hanratty, she told Aycott, "I may not be able to pick him out. My memory of this man's face is fading." The jury never knew of these doubts. Then came a vital respect in which Hanratty did not resemble the wanted man. Valerie's story had made it clear that the murderer knew little about cars or driving. In her original statements, she said, "He wanted me to start the car for him. He didn't know where the gears were. The car cut out, so I started it up again." But Hanratty knew all about cars.
Jimmy was a good driver. Well, I won't say excellent driver, but he was a very good driver. Actually, in the 50s, he taught me to drive, you know? I mean, he taught me how to use the gears, he taught me how to hold the car on the clutch, you know? So, I mean, that, to me, and of course he was well, I wouldn't say a professional car thief, but they got evidence that he was stealing cars. Well, that's not, to me, is not someone who can't drive.
I said this to the jury. Twice she started the car for him. Twice she had to explain how the gears of a Morris Minor worked, and where the reversing light was, and where the lights were, and so on. Does that sound like a car thief? Does that sound like somebody who runs around with a Jaguar motor car key in his pocket? Does that sound like somebody who is an experienced car thief? I suggest it does not. And all the prosecution could say about that was he was bluffing. He was giving them a blind to cover his tracks. But can that really have been so, when it was his intention to pump 8 or 10 bullets into that girl and leave her dead?
Soho's clubland and the criminal underworld supplied much of the remaining Crown evidence against Hanratty. Charles France, Hanratty's best friend, said Hanratty told him that the back seat of a bus was a good hiding place. The murder weapon had been found on a 36A bus. Hanratty explained that he used the bus not for hiding guns, but for dumping unwanted stolen goods. An ex-employee at the Vienna, William Nuds, testified that on the morning before the murder, he told Hanratty where to catch a 36A bus. Nuds, alias Jack Glickberg, had a string of convictions and was a notorious police informer. He made 3 conflicting statements, admitting that one was lies from start to finish. Then, the Crown produced another criminal, Roy Langdale. He claimed that in the exercise yard of Brixton Prison, Hanratty had made a full confession to the crime.
We took the view that the prosecution was scraping the barrel. We managed to find other prisoners who'd been on remand with Hanratty, whose evidence, as I remember it, was really quite convincing and sensibly given, which made it plain that Langdale simply couldn't be relied on.
At Langdale's own subsequent trial, a detective put in a good word for him. Normally, he is very helpful to police. Then came a fierce courtroom dispute over Aycott's records of the interrogations of Hanratty.
One in particular lasted an hour and 3/4. When delivered in court quite slowly, it took only 20 minutes. And so we naturally suggested, on Hanratty's instructions, that very much more had been said by him.
Aycott said that long pauses accounted for the discrepancy. Then there was a question the police did not immediately ask.
Mr. Aycott is having a conversation with him on the telephone. What do you think an experienced police officer wants to know about? Where were you on the night of the 22nd, 23rd of August last? Oh, said Mr. Aycott, I did not ask him that. I suggest that he did. I suggest he must have done. I suggest it is almost incredible that Mr. Aycott should not have done.
In the car, the gunman used the phrase, "I want a kip." Under interrogation, Hanratty allegedly used the same phrase, that he wanted to kip, but according to Aycott's records, as early as 9:30 a.m. Aycott denied Hanratty's charges of fabrication. Today, evidence not disclosed by the police is emerging. Statements by the Vienna hotel manager, by the conductress of the 36A bus, and by Valerie Story, never shown to the defense, never heard by the jury. Nor were the jury given a clear-cut motive for the crime. The prosecution could suggest only that Hanratty had chanced upon the car and turned into a rapist and killer. But if Hanratty had no motive, could anyone else? The trial made no mention of the 3-year affair between Michael Gregston and Valerie Story. It was no secret, except to the jury. One man in the public gallery became increasingly disturbed at the quality of evidence against Hanratty.
I followed the trial at Bedford. I became convinced of his innocence, and for the last 30 years, I've been fighting to clear his name and get justice done.
John Justice was particularly struck by the lack of forensic evidence.
There was no scientific evidence. As Gerard said, we have the best forensic laboratory in the world. And what have they produced in this case? Nothing. There wasn't a fiber, there wasn't a fingerprint, there wasn't a hair, nothing to connect Hanratty with that crime. And this man had been in the car for 6 hours, terrific tension, murder, rape, nothing left at all.
Hanratty had trusted that there would be forensic evidence in the murder car to clear him.
As a petty crook who'd been through the courts and been investigated very often, he would have known perfectly well that he wasn't obliged to give hair, blood, saliva samples unless he wished to do so. He volunteered those samples to the police. We thought that spoke volumes in his favor.
But Hanratty relied upon an alibi that went disastrously wrong. He said he left his basement room in the Vienna hotel on August the 22nd and then set off to sell some stolen jewellery, spending the night 200 miles away in Liverpool. But he couldn't say where or with whom he stayed. His defence team became increasingly worried.
Sherrod said to him, "I want you to go in the box, Jimmy." Well, he said, in that case, he said, it's looking a bit serious, you know. He said, well, in that case, I'll tell you the truth. I'll give you the whole alibi. I went to Liverpool on the 22nd, and from there I went to Rill, to a landlady. So I don't know the name of the street, I don't know the name of the house, but I know I was definitely there to sell these jewellery and different stuff.
Hanratty said that having casually lied at the outset, he became too scared to change his story. Now he claimed to be telling the truth, but the new Rill alibi was not promising. All Hanratty could initially recall was staying at a guest house with a green bath in the attic from where he could hear trains. So in mid-trial, investigators began hurriedly checking the guest houses of Rill, and in Kimmel Street, near the railway line, was Ingledine, run by Mrs. Grace Jones and her daughter Brenda.
The gentleman called and showed my mother and I a photograph, you see, and asked us if we recognised this person on the photograph. He seemed familiar to me, but my mother was, you know, confident that she knew him. She said, oh, he stayed at my guest house. She recognised him straight away. And then he asked my mother if she was willing to go to Bedford with him. Of course, she was quite willing to go, but we didn't know what it was all about.
The defence called her Mrs. Miracle Jones, but she made a critical mistake. She spoke to another witness, then denied it in the witness box. Her credibility was damaged. Even worse, none of her other guests that week had seen Hanratty. But how good was the real alibi? Hanratty recalled going first to the fair, hoping to see a friend who always parked his black taxi out front. But that particular evening, the taxi wasn't there.
It was back on the fair the next day, but it was definitely not there on the night of the murder. I believe that he did definitely come to that fair to look for me. And he could see if the taxi's not there, I wasn't there. So then he went looking for digs, didn't he?
She took him in, and of course all the rooms were booked at the time, but we had this room at the very top of the house. It was a bathroom really, but it was used for emergencies, and there was a bed in there. And of course he was desperate for a place to stay, so my mother mentioned it to him about this room, and of course he took that room.
Hanratty's description of Ingledean's interior matched up. The green bath is still in the attic today. But why did none of the other guests remember Hanratty?
I mean, the people were there in the trial that had stayed here the week that Hanratty was here. They were at the trial, but they didn't recognise him because he wasn't in the dining room having breakfast. There wasn't any room in the dining room. And he was the only man that had breakfast in our own living room. No one else had breakfast that season in our own living room.
But Hanratty's alibi did not ultimately depend upon Rill.
It is often said that Hanratty changed his alibi from Liverpool to Rill. That's really not quite right. The substance of the Liverpool alibi was maintained.
Even before Hanratty reached Rill on the crucial evening, a sweet shop assistant had placed him in Liverpool only about 4 hours before the crime began in Buckinghamshire.
It was very important because there was the evidence of Mrs. Dinwoodie, the lady in the sweet shop, who, if she was anything like right, had Hanratty in Liverpool. He couldn't have imagined or have invented that episode, and it was supported by that lady in material particulars. So that was of great importance. It drove the prosecution at one stage solemnly to suggest that Hanratty might have been in Liverpool and that there was an air service from Liverpool to the south which was regular, and perhaps he'd come down for the occasion and then gone back to Liverpool or Rill or whatever. That seemed to us to be quite absurd.
After 21 days, it was by then the longest murder trial in British history. Mr. Justice Gorman sent out the jury. 5 hours later, the jury, still undecided, returned for guidance. Hanratty was brought up from his cell.
So that was a rather unfortunate incident because he obviously came up having steeled himself to hear the verdict, and no verdict was available. What the jury said was, when you tell us we have to be sure, do you mean certain sure? And the judge then gave them further direction for about 20 minutes, which sounded to me a bit like, if you're asking that question, perhaps you're not certain sure.
3 hours later, the jury returned for a second time.
The jury said, can we have some supper? And the judge was furious that Hanratty there biting his fingernails, of course. He should be subjected to that sort of delay. However, somewhat irritably, because it was a great strain on the judge too. I mean, he showed the strain. He was cross, but he ordered that sandwiches should be provided, and they were. And out went the jury again.
At 9:10 that Saturday evening, the verdict was delivered.
Nearly 10 hours after they'd first retired and after the court had refilled 3 times, the jury filed back into the box. The clerk of the court asked the foreman for their verdict. "Guilty, my lord." Cries from the public gallery. Hanratty was asked if he had anything to say. After a false start and a long pause, he said, "I am innocent, my lord, and I shall appeal." The black cap was draped on the judge's wig. "James Hanratty, the sentence of the court is that you suffer death in the manner authorized by law, and may God have mercy on your soul."
Mum, I only wish you had been there and seen and heard the way this case was put to me. I was in the witness box 10 hours, and I had answered every question truthfully and correctly, but it was a waste of time. It's surprising what the law can do to an innocent man. They can turn him inside out in no time.
Directly after the end of the trial, 2 national newspapers reported an inexplicable earlier event. Just 1 week after the A6 killing, Janet Gregston, the dead man's widow, saw a smartly dressed man at a cleaner's in Swiss Cottage, North London. There were then no known suspects, yet she suddenly announced, "That's the man the police are looking for." Her brother-in-law, William Ewer, told how he followed the man, discovered his name, and reported him to the police. It was Hanratty. But Mrs. Gregston had no connection with Hanratty or the crime. How could she have picked him out of the millions on the London streets long before anyone else suspected him? No one has ever explained her extraordinary intuition. Then, 2 days after the appeal was turned down, Charles France, Hanratty's Soho friend who had testified against him, went to a West London bedsitter, turned on the gas, and committed suicide. As Hanratty awaited execution in Bedford Prison, another man began to live it up. The original suspect, Peter Alphon. At the heart of the mystery of Deadman's Hill is Peter Louis Alphon, the original police suspect. For 30 years, his private and public statements have haunted the case.
Now, there seem to be 3 different opinions of you. People think that you're either a liar, a killer, or that you're mentally disturbed and unbalanced. Which are you?
Maybe it's all 3.
Throughout the A6 murder trial, the name of Peter Alphon recurred. John Justice was intrigued.
I decided halfway through the trial to have a word with the first suspect. We'll go along and see if there's anything he knows. He might be able to help or might know something. And it was rather difficult to find him.
Justice first traced Alphon to the Ariel, then a newly opened and expensive hotel by London Airport. By the end of the trial, Alphon had moved back to central London to another expensive hotel.
I got a call from the Regent Palace Hotel in Piccadilly. So I wondered why, when Hanratty was found guilty, as he moved after 3 months from the Ariel Hotel to the middle of Piccadilly Circus. And I said, well, what do you think of the verdict? He said, well, it surprised me a little bit. I was at White City, I heard it, but Hanratty's expendable.
Hanratty was then awaiting execution. Justice decided to pursue the acquaintance of Peter Alphon.
And one evening, he produced the most extraordinary thing. And I looked at it, it took ages to see it. You read it, you see quite clearly Peter MacDougall.
Alphon had checked into the hotel as Peter MacDougall.
And the other side, murderer. I was stunned.
Peter Alphon, the original suspect, appeared to be making a veiled confession to the A6 murder. What were his movements around August the 22nd, 1961? In the evening after the Morris Minor was abandoned in East London, Alphon checked into the Alexandra Court Hotel in Finsbury Park. Over the next few days, he behaved so suspiciously that the manager and other guests decided to contact the police. According to a witness statement never previously disclosed, one guest thought that Alphon must be in hiding. Police records confirm that Alphon had again used a false name, and that they planned to examine his clothing and check his movements. Within 5 days of the murder, Alphon was taken in for questioning. He said that on the evening of the murder he saw his mother and then stayed the night at the Vienna Hotel, the first mention of the Vienna in relation to the case. His story was corroborated by a hotel employee, the self-confessed liar William Nuds. But other than his mother and the Nuds evidence, nobody could confirm where Alphon spent the night of the murder. The hotel manager, Juliana Galvez, first saw him in his room the following morning, at 11:45 a.m. Alphon's mother was visited by Superintendent Aycott. The new documents proved that Mrs. Alphon did not confirm the alibi. She did not know on which of 3 evenings she had seen her son. Alphon's alibi now depended on William Nuds. Nuds was taken to Scotland Yard. Now he too said he hadn't seen Alphon until the morning after the murder. That day, Superintendent Aycott publicly named Peter Alphon as the man wanted in connection with the A6 murder.
Bob Aycott was convinced that Alphon was the man. No doubt in his mind at all. Now, I'd had 10 years in Fleet Street before I went to the BBC, and I'd never known the police to actually name a person they wanted to talk to in such a positive way, sort of ruling out any doubt that he was the man they wanted.
In the middle of the night, Alphon walked into Scotland Yard. Aycott returned immediately and interrogated him until 5:15 in the morning. The following day, Alphon was put on an identity parade before Valerie Story. It was then that she picked out not Alphon, but the innocent RAF corporal, and was left in tears. Alphon was set free. Aycott had publicly sought Alphon, yet in court he explained that one of his reasons for eliminating Peter Alphon, apart from the ID parade, was that his suspect was called Jim. The jury was never told that Valerie Story had actually told Aycott that Jim was obviously not the killer's proper name. In court, Aycott said that the killer was in his mid-20s. Hanratty was 25. Aycott ruled out Alphon because of his age. He was 30. But Valerie Story's original estimate of the killer's age had been precisely 30. Alphon, said Aycott, should also be ruled out because my inquiries showed he had not driven a motor car. Yet Valerie Story's evidence had pointed directly to an incompetent motorist. Aycott said in court that an important argument in clearing Alphon was that he volunteered for a range of scientific tests. But the latest documents reveal that Alphon refused to tell police where he was keeping some of his clothes and a piece of luggage. Neither the defense nor the jury ever knew about this. It was Hanratty who, from the outset, had offered up his clothes for forensic examination. Peter Alphon watched in court as Aycott ruled him out as the A6 murderer. Hanratty went to the gallows, but it would not be the last that was heard of Peter Alphon. John Justice had a fellow campaigner who also befriended Alphon.
As a barrister and member of the establishment, I couldn't really believe that this sort of thing could happen. I knew Hanratty had been convicted. I was meeting Alphon daily. He struck me as a reasonable sort of person, and I was highly skeptical of John's claim that Alphon was the murderer. I later became convinced. Alphon made a verbal confession to the murder to me in the Blue Angel Club in Berkeley Square one evening. He asked me to look him straight in the eye, which I did, and he said to me, "I did that murder." He said they were obviously an immoral couple in the car, and he had a mission in life to stamp out vice and immorality. I said to him, "You know, Mrs. Hanratty feels pretty badly about her son being hanged for a murder he didn't commit." And the look of anguish that came over Alphon's face at that moment finally convinced me that he was indeed the A6 killer.
A private confession just 3 months after the execution. 5 years later, Alphon went to Paris, called a press conference, and made a public confession.
The real reason why I've confessed, and I said it at the press conference, is I want to drag the name of British justice in the mud, where it belongs. I think I neglected to say that at the press conference, where it belongs, in the mud. I might be inviting a lynching, but I think, you see, the thing is this murder happened 6 years ago, and they've hanged someone wrongfully. They've hanged him wrongfully.
It was Alphon who first provided a motive for the crime. He said he was asked by someone close to the Gregston family to frighten Valerie Story and Michael Gregston so that Gregston would return to his wife and children. Alphon said he had a mission.
Crusade was against indecency, immorality. Those two things, that's enough, isn't it?
Alphon claimed to have collected £5,000 in the wake of the murder. He has implicated others in his confessions, but there is no evidence against them. But there was more to connect Alphon with the A6 murder. A newly discovered document reveals that Alphon later told other Metropolitan policemen, "There can't have been any fingerprints on the car, otherwise mine would have given me away."
If you were charged in the future, how would you take that?
With the A6 murder?
Yes.
I should be, well, if I said I'd be delighted, well, that may be a little bit hard for your audience, the general public, to appreciate. But as I've been charged with so many things that I haven't done, I would at last like to see the British police charge me with something I have done.
James Hanratty's father promised his son that he would prove his innocence. He spent years campaigning, enlisting the support of prominent politicians, journalists, notably Paul Foote, and celebrities like John Lennon, who sponsored a film about the A6 campaign dedicated to clearing Hanratty's name.
judge for yourselves, and that's all I ask you to do. There's 11 witnesses up in North Wales swears in all doubt that Hanratty was there on the night of the 22nd. The Home Office knows they got the evidence, but they just don't want an inquiry. Why? There was doubt at Bedford when they executed him. They know they've got the evidence. Lord Russell, Lord Brockway, Miss Joan Lester, and 180 MPs says in Parliament James Hanratty was innocent.
Campaigners believed that there was a straightforward explanation, that someone else had put the gun on a London bus where Hanratty dumped stolen property on a day that no one claimed Hanratty was even in London. That the cartridge cases were put in Hanratty's hotel room, although Hanratty had last stayed there 3 weeks earlier, the night before the murder. And the A6 killer had said, "Call me Jim."
And that's where it's set up. Hanratty was framed, definitely framed.
James Hanratty Sr. died in 1978. He believed to the end that the whole truth about his son's case had never come out.
It would shock if the truth is known, because it is very simple, the solution. Either James Hanratty is the A6 killer, and I've wasted 30 years of my life and we're all wrong, or else people are alive today who knew at the time of his execution that he was innocent.
John Justice's last interview. He died on July the 1st, 1990. Peter Alphon still lives in London today. He declined to be interviewed, but a few weeks ago he made his latest written confession. He says he began shooting involuntarily. He continues to implicate others against whom there is no evidence. Valerie Story was left paralyzed by the shooting on Deadman's Hill. Her last public statement was in 1966. She reaffirmed her certainty that Hanratty was the killer. Almost everyone involved 30 years ago and still alive today remains blighted by the case, because it has never been satisfactorily resolved. In Scotland Yard today, there are 16 boxes of papers and evidence on the case. The Metropolitan Police refuse to release them to the Hanratty family lawyers. The contents, the police say, are confidential and could endanger living persons. The Crown is seeking to keep them locked up for 75 years. The police also hold exhibits from which today's DNA scientists could finally establish guilt or innocence. That too is withheld. Over the 30 years, new evidence has steadily emerged. Certainly, the Bedford jury never heard all the available evidence before convicting James Hanratty.
I went to the Home Office. I discussed the case at very great length. They listened attentively. I found that they were very thoroughly familiar with the case itself and the material that was not adduced at the trial. I had expected that there would be a reprieve. In the event, there was no reprieve. I was very upset.
On the morning of the execution, a small crowd gathered at Bedford Prison.
And then the moment came. It was a very fraught moment. And over on the left, about 5 yards away, was the platform with the drop, with the hole. On the right, again about 5 yards away, directly opposite, was the door through which the condemned man would come. He did. He came in with the two executioners. They had already bound his hands behind his back. He was marched to the platform, marched is perhaps the right word, because strut is almost the word. He was clearly putting a very, very brave face on it.
Dear Mum and Dad, I still find it very hard to believe what is about to happen. But, Mum, I promise you that I will face it like a man. And I'm sure that is the way you and Dad would want it. Mum, the time is getting near, and when it comes I will be thinking of you and Dad, and that will give me lots of courage and strength. Until we meet again, you will always be in my thoughts. God bless you all. Your ever-loving son, Jim.
By now, the flour sack, like a flour sack, has been put over his head, while the other executioner is adjusting a similar bit of rope round his legs. And then the chief executioner arranged the knot, an important feature, I imagine, but and then he stood clear, pulled a lever, reminding one a little bit of the old-fashioned signalman's lever. The floor dropped away, the trap dropped away, down went Hanratty. The governor was clearly distressed. I could hear him breathing heavily behind me. And it was distressing, of course. I mean, something that stayed with me vividly for about 3 months. You know, one never forgets that. We then went back. The cell was open, and there was his bedclothes thrown back, pyjamas on bed, empty cup of tea on the bedside table. It was such a domestic scene, and I think that was almost the worst bit. You've just killed this man, you know.
I feel that one day my name will be cleared without any doubt. With that knowledge, there is no need for you and Dad to be ashamed of any gossip or any remarks of any sort. When eventually the truth does come to light, people will regret the remarks they've made against me. People today don't seem to have any conscience at all.